April 11th of 1945 was the liberation of the Buchenwald concentration camp in Germany. And there are a couple of things that I think you should know about that camp that I think are worth mentioning. The first thing is that the name of the camp means beech forest, and in fact, the camp was built on what had been this big beech forest. All of the beech trees were cut down. One remaining tree was left. That was one of the Goethe oaks, because Goethe had written, supposedly, his greatest works under these giant oak trees that were around Germany. And leaving those oak trees was part of some sort of low-grade prophecy that as long as those oak trees stood, then Germany would hold its power. So in the middle of this concentration camp is a giant oak tree that is supposed to hold the power, or at least be able to predict the fall of Germany. Then I want you to know that in this concentration camp, there are not only the concentration camp, but there's an electronics factory. And what they were doing was pulling the very most skilled prisoners, people who had been electrical engineers, people who had been scientists, people who had been high up in academia, and they were having them assemble the electronic parts that were allowing bombs to drop at specific locations. So this electronics work was being done there. But the people doing it were also smart enough to realize what they were doing. And they got a hold of a radio transmitter. There actually were supposedly like 7 of them in the camps. They got a hold of a radio transmitter, and they started sending out signals to the Allied forces, trying to explain what was happening and where the camp was and what the electronics were that they were assembling. They had no idea if this was actually going anywhere. They had radios that they could hear bits and pieces in, and then they were transmitting out, but they had no idea if they were getting their signal out somewhere. And this has been well documented. It also is one of the things that gets muddled in my head, is that it is the focus of a book called Block 26, Sabotage at Buchenwald, which is written by a Frenchman named Pierre Juliet, and he was in the camp. He survived. He left the camp and wrote this book in French that was later translated to English that outlines what happened. But he chooses, as a literary device, to change all the names and keep everybody's identity private. And he explains that the reason he does this in the book is because he, at this point in his life that he's writing, understands why the people who didn't fight back, who chose not to be involved in trying to transmit this information and essentially sabotage the plant, didn't do so, right? And he doesn't want to drag anybody's names through the muck, so he makes up aliases. He explains all of it. It's exactly that mid-century French to English translation kind of. It has a specific flavor to it, and it's well worth the read. It's almost impossible to get in paper, but archive copies exist online if you want to search it down. And in that book and in reality, what happens is they get the information out to the Allied forces. The Allied forces begin flying over the camp, right? The electronics factory is right next to this camp where all of these innocent folks are living. And the Allied forces fly over, they do a bunch of reconnaissance, they do photography, and then they do the most specific bombing probably of all of World War II. They take out the electronics factory, leaving the concentration camp next to it. Now, some of the factory workers died in the explosion, in the bombing of the factory, but most of the people in the camp survived, and the electronics factory was destroyed, which meant that these bombs were no longer being supplied with this level of tech. And only one bomb dropped on the concentration camp. And this is real. This is not just in the novel. This seems to be true. One bomb dropped on the concentration camp, and it dropped on the Goethe oak. which meant that the prophecy that Germany would fall was kind of fulfilled in the eyes of the people in the camp. And apparently there was literally like everybody wanted a piece of this burnt up, splintered oak tree. Like they collected it and passed it around, and like everybody wanted one as essentially like a token of like visible Germany will fall. And then it did. Also, Buchenwald did end up continuing to act as a concentration camp prison for a while after the fall, because it was then transferred to USSR, where they held some of their political prisoners, essentially. So it was not a clean transfer of, okay, and now this is a history museum. There were more atrocities in terms of civil rights being done there for a while, and then eventually it became what it is today, which is a museum to that.